Let's now start implementing the next feature of our application, which is going to be the search functionality. And let's start by taking a look at our flowchart here. And so again, we already have this part here basically now implemented. And now we are going to work basically first on this part. So handling the event of a user searching for recipes, then loading the search results and rendering them. So that's going to be this lecture and the next one. And then afterwards, we are going to worry about the pagination. So again, we will now focus on these three parts. And so for that, we need to now implement the model, the view, and the controller that binds everything together. And usually I find it easiest to start with the data. So basically with the model, which means in this case, starting to make some API calls in order to load some search results. And then once we have that part working, we can then render them on the screen and also care about the actual event. Okay, so let's actually leave that open here at the end and go to our model here and start implementing the search functionality. So, just like before, we are going to create a function that will be exported so that it can be used by the controller. And this one, I'm going to call it load search results. And so since this one will be performing AJAX calls, it's going to be an async function. Now, again, this function here is going to be called by the controller. And so it's going to be the controller who will tell this function what it should actually search for. So basically, it will pass in a query like string, which we can then plug into our API call. All right. And here we are going to need a try catch block. And here in the catch block, all we will do is to basically do the same as here. So all we're really interested in here is to throw the error again so that eventually we will be able to use it in the controller. So just like before in the last lecture where we threw the error here again. So that part is easy, but now let's actually implement the functionality. And to do that, let's go back to our documentations page. And so this is how we get all recipes. So making a get request to this path, and then with the search parameter. And the way we add a parameter, and I think I explained this before, is with the question mark, and then search equal, and then pizza here in our case is actually the search query. And again, for now, don't worry about the key. And we can actually already see what the results will look like here for pizza. And so basically, this is the URL that we need to call in our AJAX request. So let me actually copy it. And let's go back. And so now we can, just like before, use the getJSON method. And so that will then fetch the data and also convert it to JSON and create an error if something went wrong. So getJSON returns a promise, and so we await that here and store it into data, just like always. So getJSON, and then the URL, and we need a template literal. And so, yeah, now we just have to replace everything to make this work. And the first thing is to actually take this here again out and replace it with this API URL that we already have in our configuration file, right? So API URL, and I think that actually already includes the recipes. Yep, so it's everything. And usually, actually a URL ends with a slash. So it should be like this. And so here, let's take that out, actually, and then here as well. Then here, question mark search, and then this one is going to be our query. All right. And so we can then already log that data to the console to take a look at it before we then manipulate it a little bit. And so right now, this should already be working. And so let's, before we actually write any controller or any view, we can already call that function here. So load search results. And then let's try it, as always, with pizza and see what we get. So that's right here. And indeed, this is the result that we get here. So it's coming from model at line 35. So that's where we were. And so here is the data that we get back. So we have an object which has a data property, which then has a recipes property, which is this array. And then each array contains all of this data about each of the recipes. So again, this object here is called data. Then in there is data again. And then in there is recipes, which is then the array itself, where each of the elements is an object with only some of the data about the recipe. So you see, it's not the complete recipe object. It's only some of the data so that we can actually display it then here in the search results. So without the unnecessary data like ingredients and all that. All right, so let's now take this data and store it into our state. And also we will want to change, again, this one here, so to image only. And so we will basically create some new objects based on this data that we receive here. All right, so we get data.data.recipes. So this is the array. So this is the array of all the objects. And now we want to create a new array which contains the new objects where the property names are different. So let's map over this. And each element is going to be a recipe. And then here we will simply return a new object. Let's actually copy the code from here because they are the same, at least some of them. So taking all this, and here now this is only called a rec. Okay, and also we don't have the source URL. We only have ID, title, publisher, and image URL. Okay, so this will return a new array with the new objects. And so now where should we store that? Well, as you can guess, we will put it also in our state. So again, the state contains all the data that we need in order to build our application. So let's call this one search. And all the data about the application that I just mentioned might as well also include the search query itself. So let's create a new object here and then specify the query, which we start as an empty string, and then the results, let's say. Results will start as an empty array. So basically the state should contain all the data really about the application. Now in this case, we might not even need the query for now, but it's still a good idea to already store it here in the state. Because maybe one day we will need it, and then the data is already there for us. For example, we might want to add some analytics in the future to know which queries are made the most. And so by then, yeah, as I said, that would become useful. Okay. But anyway, let's now store this data in state.search.results, right? And here at the beginning, the very first thing that we're going to do is to state.search.query equal to query. All right. And now let's quickly, just to see if everything worked, log that to the console. So state.search.results. And here we are. So that is exactly the kind of array that we had before. And now the image URL we had before is indeed called image. And so everything has the same format as before. So we needed to do that because here the image is also called image. And of course, we want everything to have the same names throughout the entire application. All right. So let's get rid of this because, of course, we want to call this function in the controller. And so let's go there to the controller and basically create a new function, which is going to be like the new controller. So const control search results. And so this one will call the asynchronous function load search results. And so this one, of course, then also need to be an asynchronous function itself. And so, as always, try catch. And here for now, let's simply log the error, and we will then fix that later. So here is where we actually will want to call the load search results that we just built. So that is in model.load search results. And here we then will need to pass in the query, but for now let's just do that again manually. And of course we need to await this, but we do not store any result anywhere because just like the load recipe function, this one also doesn't return anything. All it does is to manipulate the state. And so then we should be able to do this console.log in the controller and still get access to the results, right? So let's see. Now, of course, we first have to also call this function. And again, later we will, of course, hook this up to an event listener. But here, let's just call it right away. And now we get state is not defined. All right. And that is because, of course, it needs to be model.state.search.results. So you see that this is becoming a pretty long chain here. But never mind, that's not a problem at all, because we know exactly what all of this is. And so now indeed we get back our 59 search results for pizza. But now, instead of only searching for pizza, we actually want to get the query right here from this input field, right? And we also want to start this whole process of loading the search results. So we only want that to happen when this button here is clicked. And so now let's basically create a view only for this search part here. So right here, we will have a view for this here. So for the search field and for the button, and then a different view, which will actually render the results. So it's a good idea to keep every view really focused. And so it's best to just do one for this part and then one for displaying the results. Also because in the user interface, they're actually in kind of different places also. So it makes sense to have a different view. Now this view here is of course not going to render anything, but what it will do is to basically give us the content of this input field. So getting that input data is of course something that has to do with the DOM. And so it should be in a view and not in a controller, right? So of course, if we wanted to be lazy, we could go ahead and select the element that we want. So it doesn't matter. And then from there, we would simply get the value and then use that as our query. So again, we could do that here, but this is clearly about the DOM. And so in order to follow our architecture, we will create a new view right now. And this one is going to be called the search view.js. And just like before, here we will create a class called search view. And we will then not export that class, but export an instance, so an object that was created by this class. So export default new search view, and without passing in any data. Then, just like before, we will have a parent element. So just like in the recipe view, so a parent element, and then we will set that to something, query selector. And now let's see what we get here in the DOM, so in the HTML. So the search, it's this one. So we have this entire form, which is called search, and which has this input field here, and also the button. And so I think that this is the element that makes sense to select. So the one with the class of search. So dot search. So this is our parent element here in this case. Now, again, this class is not going to render anything. All we want is to get the query and eventually to also listen for the click event on the button. But let's start with the query here. And so let's create a method that we will then call from the controller called getQuery. And all this will do is to return this dot parent element. And so again, that's going to be the search. And then from there, we want to select this input field. So this one with this class. And so let's select this child element using query selector. And then simply get the value of that. Okay. And that's actually it. And again, of course, we could have written this exact same code in a controller, but that wouldn't make any sense because this is not concerned about the DOM at all. So we don't want to have any DOM elements in here. We don't even want to know what the DOM looks like. So actually here we have this, but we don't want this here. Let's get rid of all this clutter here actually. And now I want to get the search view here. And then here we can get that query by saying search view dot get query. And of course there might be no query, and so let's add another guard clause here. So if there is no query, then return immediately. And so here we will now no longer look for pizza, but for query. Now, if we run this, then of course there will be no result because, well, right now there is nothing here to be found. So that controller function runs right in the beginning when the application actually loads. And so by then, of course, there is no value here. And so in order to actually make this work, we now need to listen for the event of basically clicking this button or submitting this form. And then only on that event, we want to actually call this controller function here. So not in the beginning when the script loads. So in order to do that, we will once again use the publisher subscriber pattern. So basically exactly what we did here, right? So we will listen for the event in the view right here, and then pass the controller function, so the handler function, into the method that we will build here. So this add handler search method here is basically going to be the publisher, and the control search results function is going to be the subscriber. Okay, so hopefully you really understood that pattern that we used before, and so this now should be obvious. So let's take our parent element, so this dot parent element of course, And then this is where we will actually add the event listener. So not to the button, but really to the entire form, because there we can listen for the submit event. And so then this will work no matter if the user clicks the submit button or if the user hits enter while typing the query. Now here we cannot simply call the handler immediately, because remember, as we did many times before, when we submit a form, we need to first prevent the default action, because otherwise the page is going to reload. So prevent default, and only after that we can call the handler function. And as you already know, this handler function should be the control search results function. And so all we have to do now is to call this method and pass in that function. So let's do that here right at the beginning. So search view dot add handler search. So you see that I'm always going to use this name here of add handler. And then we pass in the controller function. And that's it. So now it should actually already work. So let's see, and actually let's clear up all this clutter here a little bit. Okay, so this console.log, and there's also some here in the recipe view. So that's this one. Okay, so let's again try pizza. And yeah, beautiful, it worked. So we get this data first here coming from the model, and then also in the controller we also logged it. And so here we have the exact same 59 data that we had before. Let's try something else now. Avocado, let's say. So I hit enter, and so this time we got 39 search results. And you see all of them basically have avocado right there in the title. That's really beautiful that it already works this great. Now just one small detail is that after we search, we should probably clear out this field. So let's add another small method for that in the view. So in this one here, so clear input, and once again, having it nicely encapsulated inside of the search view. So again, this could simply be also in a controller because it's really just one line of code, but we want to keep everything separated. This will make it so much easier to add features in the future, and it's really so much better. So all we do is to set this to empty, and that's it. All right. Let's try it one more time. Let's say pasta this time. Of course, we never called the method here anywhere. So we need to do that in the controller. And let's actually add some more comments here. So get search query. And the code itself is actually pretty self-explanatory. And so many developers will tell you you should not comment it, but I think that this is actually very helpful when you read the code in like 1 or 2 years from now. So I would advise you to always write comments like this, even if your code seems pretty obvious, especially when it's like a bigger list of instructions like this. So render results. So right now our rendering is only a console.log. But here, when we get the search query, we can actually then immediately also clear it afterwards. Or in fact, in order to keep this controller even simpler, we can do that right in the getQuery method. So let's go back here. And now we can make this private, so we're not going to use it outside. And then let's actually call it here. So this dot clear input. And then of course we first need to store this somewhere here. So we get the query, then we clear the field, and then we return the query. All right, so that should now work. So pasta, it clears the field and gives us our 45 results down here about pasta. Great. So that works just fine. And so all there's left to do is to now implement actually the view. So the second view basically, so the one that is responsible for then rendering all the results here in this sidebar. And so that's going to be a little bit of work. So let's leave that for the next video.